My son-in-law thought I was asleep when he slipped into the room and carefully took my phone. His fingers trembled, but curiosity was stronger. He was searching for secrets, dirt, proof of my weakness. I remained still, letting him feel like a winner. But the one photograph he found turned out to be nothing like what he expected. That image marked the beginning of the collapse, of his confidence, his family, and everything he believed was holding him up. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Raymond Keller. I was 74 years old the night I heard the sound that changed everything. I had worked as a construction accountant for over 40 years, most of them spent poring over blueprints, cost sheets, and receipts in the quiet corners of project trailers and corporate offices. My hands still bore the quiet stiffness of decades punching numbers, and my eyes had grown slow to adjust after years under fluorescent lights. But my ears had always been sharp enough to hear the faint groan of wood in a house at rest, sharp enough to tell the difference between wind and footsteps. I had been living with my daughter and her family for nearly 6 months. They took me in after my second stroke made it clear I could no longer handle the stairs in my own home. Selling the house was a quiet grief I didn't voice. The realtor had smiled too much. The buyers called it cozy and a great flip. They'd torn out the lilac bush in the front yard before the ink on the papers was even dry. I didn't go back. At my daughter's house, I was given the smallest bedroom, tucked behind the laundry room next to the water heater closet. The window faced a fence. The walls were thin. At night, I could hear the dishwasher cycle through its final rinse, the hum of the central air turning off, the soft clicks of cabinet doors upstairs as if the house was chewing its own thoughts in the dark. The bed was too soft and low to the ground. It made my knees ache when I tried to stand. That particular night had been humid. Late July in Ohio always felt like being gently pressed between 2 wet towels. The air hung in my lungs like cotton. I'd fallen asleep in a light t-shirt, no blanket. The fan on the nightstand rotated with a steady rhythm, clicking each time it reached its turning point. I remembered listening to it. 1 click, 2, silence. 1 click, 2, silence. And then, a different sound. It was the sound of my doorknob turning slowly. Not a squeak, just the soft compression of the latch, like someone pressing their thumb into the belly of a ripe peach. I kept my eyes shut. My body tensed, but not visibly. I'd been a light sleeper since the army, and the skill had never left me. A man learns to breathe differently when he pretends to sleep. Shallower, more spaced. Still. The door opened. I heard it. So careful, so deliberate. I caught the faint scent of cologne, something sharp and modern, the kind with a blue label and ads filled with fast cars and shirtless men. Not the kind I ever wore. It was my son-in-law, Michael. He moved quietly, too quietly for someone who just wanted to check on an old man. His steps were soft against the carpet, but they paused, just briefly, when he reached the bed. I could feel his presence like static. I heard the rustle of his jeans when he crouched. Then I felt the lightest brush of his hand on the nightstand. My phone was there. He picked it up. He must have thought I was sound asleep. Stroke patients, he likely assumed, slept like the dead. I let my breath slow even more, let my arm stay limp against the side of the mattress. My fingers twitched involuntarily, but he didn't seem to notice. I heard him move back toward the door, probably to stand under the hallway light. I knew that light buzzed. I'd heard it enough times when I hobbled to the bathroom at 3 a.m. He didn't turn it on. Instead, I heard the faint taps, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to unlock a screen. I had no passcode. I'd left it that way on purpose. Most people don't expect old men to guard secrets. The tapping paused. Silence again. Then a slow exhale, like someone watching a movie they didn't understand. A pause. Then another tap. Maybe he scrolled. Maybe he zoomed in. Maybe he stopped breathing. I stayed still. My arm had gone numb from lying on one side, and my neck was starting to stiffen, but I didn't move. He returned the phone to the exact same place, so carefully it sent a chill through me. Then the door clicked shut again, and I heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway. Soft, fast, calculated. I opened my eyes in the dark. The ceiling fan above me turned lazily, one blade slightly out of balance. The red light from the smoke detector blinked once every 10 seconds. The house had resumed its breathing, but something had shifted. Something vital. I stared at the phone on the nightstand without touching it. He had found the photograph, the one I had taken 40 years ago, back when I still had dark hair and a sharper jawline. The one I kept not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. It showed a man beside me, his hand on my shoulder, smiling too wide for the camera. A man whose reputation had since risen like scaffolding around the state. He was no one to my family, but everything to the balance of our lives. I never told them who he was, never told them what we'd signed, but the photo was there, in my gallery, not hidden, not labeled, just waiting. I knew Michael. I'd watched him maneuver in conversations, watched him with clients and colleagues, pretending to be polite while angling for control. He was the kind of man who mistook kindness for weakness, silence for surrender. He saw old age as an opportunity. To him, I was a closed drawer, and now he thought he had the key. But he didn't know the rest of the story. He didn't know what the photo meant, or how many things it was connected to. He didn't know the reason I never deleted it, or how many people it could shake if placed in the right hands, or the wrong ones. I closed my eyes again, but I didn't sleep. Not that night. My body stayed still, but my mind began to move, not in panic, in quiet calibration. I had lived long enough to understand that control wasn't about speaking louder or moving faster. It was about knowing what the other man thought he knew, and letting him walk straight into his own story. Michael had opened the door thinking he was the thief, but I had left it open. The next morning came with no ceremony. The light bled slowly through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the beige walls of my room. It was the kind of light that didn't warm anything, just revealed it. I heard the usual sounds of the house waking up, cabinet doors thudding too hard, the sharp squeal of the microwave, the distant shuffle of cartoon voices from the living room TV. I stayed in bed longer than usual, not because I was tired, but because I didn't want to move. Stillness had become a kind of armor. When I finally sat up, my body reminded me of every year I had lived. My knees ached in that dull, constant way that made you feel like you were sinking into yourself. I reached for my slippers, the left one more worn than the right, and I stared at them for a moment before slipping them on. The floor was cold under my soles, and the air in the room carried that metallic morning chill only older bones could detect. I didn't touch the phone. Not yet. I washed my face in the tiny bathroom off the hallway, letting the water run for a long time before I cupped it in my hands. I didn't look at myself in the mirror. I'd long stopped checking for signs of life in that reflection. My face no longer surprised me, but it no longer reassured me either. It was simply there, like a placeholder the world no longer looked at directly. At the breakfast table, Michael was already seated, dressed in a crisp polo shirt, his hair damp from the shower. He scrolled through his phone absently, but I saw the way his eyes flicked toward me when he thought I wasn't looking. My daughter Janine busied herself with the toast and the fruit bowl. She didn't sit. She hovered, as she often did now, like someone always anticipating something she couldn't name. I didn't speak. Neither did he. Silence filled the space between us, not as a bridge, but as a wall. It was the kind of silence that didn't just happen. It was built, brick by careful brick, by choices made, and words withheld. I could feel his smugness under the quiet. He had the expression of a man who believed he had seen something he shouldn't have seen, but was glad he had. That brittle confidence, that mistaken sense of power. I lifted my coffee slowly, held the mug with both hands. The warmth seeped into my fingers, but did nothing for the cold inside. The toast was dry, the jam too sweet. My appetite had grown smaller since the stroke, but that morning it vanished altogether. Still I chewed, mechanically, playing the part. I didn't look up. I didn't ask questions. I let the silence stretch until it touched the corners of the room. Janine kissed Michael on the head before heading out to take the kids to school. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She didn't notice that I hadn't said a word, or maybe she did, and chose not to. Once the door closed behind her, the room grew heavier. Michael poured himself another cup of coffee. The scrape of the chair legs against the floor echoed longer than it should have. I kept my gaze on the small window over the sink, where the neighbor's maple tree leaned just slightly toward our yard. Its leaves were beginning to brown at the edges. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. Eventually, he left for work. I listened to the rhythm of his shoes down the hallway, the soft click of his car keys, the way the door latch caught before releasing. The sound of the engine pulling away wasn't loud, but it felt final. I was alone again. I returned to my room and sat at the edge of the bed. My phone remained on the nightstand where he had left it, slightly tilted, screen dark. I picked it up. The weight of it felt different. He hadn't deleted the photo. He wouldn't dare, but he'd seen it. I scrolled through the gallery, not to check for missing images, but to trace the story he had stitched together in his mind. He didn't know the context. He only had the shape of something dangerous, not the blade itself. That's what made him confident. And it's what made him stupid. I turned the phone off and placed it in the drawer. I spent the rest of the morning in silence, not just in sound, but in motion. I didn't read the paper. I didn't turn on the television. I sat in the old recliner by the window and watched the shadows move across the wall. Sometimes, you have to let a house breathe, just to see where the cracks begin to form. In the afternoon, Janine returned. She brought me a sandwich from the deli I liked. Turkey and Swiss on rye, no mustard. I thanked her with a nod. She lingered in the doorway for a moment longer than usual, as if waiting for a question she didn't want to hear. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. I noticed she hadn't worn her wedding ring that day. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. That evening, as the sun pulled its light low across the back fence, I watched Michael's car return. He got out slower than usual. He carried nothing. No briefcase, no laptop bag, just keys and a face that tried too hard to be blank. He didn't speak to me when he came in. He kissed Janine quickly and disappeared into the upstairs office. Dinner was quieter than breakfast. The children talked among themselves about school projects and cafeteria mishaps. Janine asked me once if I wanted more mashed potatoes. I shook my head. Michael didn't look up from his plate. He didn't need to. He thought he had already won. After the dishes were cleared, I went back to my room. I locked the door. It was a flimsy lock, more symbolic than secure, but it gave me a moment to think. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, listening. The house didn't creak that night. It held its breath, as if waiting. My own breath was steady. My thoughts were not. There's a silence that lives in houses like this. Not the silence of rest, but the silence of calculation. A silence that wraps itself around the edges of picture frames and waits behind the folds of curtains. That's the silence I was sitting in, the kind that watches back. Michael had entered my room as a thief, but I had let him. I had given him the bait, left it unguarded, unlocked. I wanted to see what kind of man he was when he thought no one was looking. I had seen enough. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly guess, was that the silence he left behind wasn't empty. It was full of teeth. The photograph had been taken on a cold, dry afternoon in 1986. I remembered the exact feel of the wind that day, how it came in from the east and swept dust across the unfinished foundation, coating the steel beams and the soles of my boots. We stood in front of what would become the largest government-subsidized housing development in the county. At the time, it looked like nothing more than dirt and promises, but we had the blueprints, the permits, and the backing of men who didn't like having their names printed, but always made sure their initials were carved deep into contracts. I had been working for Cleveland Marston Construction for 12 years when the project landed on my desk. I wasn't anyone special, just a senior accountant with a clean record and a quiet reputation. I wasn't the type they invited to steak dinners or poker nights, but they trusted me. I had a habit of getting things done on time, without asking too many questions, and without making mistakes. The man in the photograph with me was not a builder. He wasn't an architect or even a city planner. He was the kind of man who had people who did things for him. People who answered phones with last names. People who never wrote emails. The kind of man whose presence made rooms quieter, even if he didn't speak. Back then, he wasn't famous, but he was rising. His influence grew in corridors I didn't walk, and his ambitions reached into files I wasn't supposed to read. But he liked me. Or at least, he liked my silence. The day the photo was taken, he had come down to the site in a heavy black coat. His shoes were polished to a shine that didn't belong in the mud. I remembered how uncomfortable he looked, standing in a place that hadn't yet learned how to hold weight. I was holding a clipboard, squinting into the sun. He put his hand on my shoulder just before the shutter clicked. It wasn't meant to be a memory. It was documentation, proof of presence. We were finalizing a deal that required some creative accounting, one that shifted funds from one pile to another with just enough gray in the margins to keep everyone clean. The paperwork was in triplicate, signed in the back of a car with tinted windows. I filed my copies away like I always did, and never mentioned it again. The photograph survived by accident. It was one of the last prints from a disposable camera my wife had picked up at the grocery store. She'd used most of the film on garden shots and family birthdays, but the final few frames captured me at work. She had taken it from across the street. She didn't know the man who stood next to me. To her, he was just another suit in the background. When the prints came back, I slipped that photo into a folder and tucked it into the back of my filing cabinet. I wasn't afraid of what it showed. There was nothing illegal in the picture itself, but I understood its power. It placed a man with ambitions next to a paper trail he thought had vanished. It was a dot on the map of something much larger, something quiet, and something extremely fragile. Years passed. The building went up. The tenants moved in. The man beside me moved further up the ladder until his name appeared on signs, on ballots, on plaques. He became the kind of man who appeared on Sunday morning television and told the country what it needed. He wore flag pins and spoke in rehearsed warmth. He aged into a symbol, and like all symbols, he forgot the details that had built him. But I hadn't. I moved on from that company after a heart scare in 1993, retired early, moved to a smaller house. I stayed off the radar. I never told Janine about that chapter of my life. She knew I had worked in construction finance, but she never asked much beyond that. She assumed my life had been spreadsheets and project meetings. I let her believe that. Every now and then, I'd open that folder, not out of nostalgia, just curiosity. I'd run my thumb along the edge of the paper, still sharp, still firm. The photo hadn't faded. I kept it between two sheets of acid-free backing, the way archivists preserve evidence. I never scanned it, never uploaded it. I didn't trust clouds or algorithms. Some things belonged to silence. But one day, not long before my first stroke, I took a photo of it with my phone. I can't explain why. Maybe because I felt something shifting. Maybe because I knew the body betrays you in increments, and I wanted to leave a trail behind. I didn't label the file. I didn't send it anywhere. It lived in a folder called MISC, between pictures of squirrels on the back porch and screenshots of parking receipts. Anyone who found it wouldn't recognize the man beside me, but someone smart enough and greedy enough might dig. Michael was smart enough, or at least he thought he was. He'd seen the photo. I could feel it in the way he looked at me across the table. That subtle shift in tone when he asked about my pension, about my savings, about old work friends. He was building a bridge in his mind, trying to connect me to something valuable, something dangerous. But he was too young to understand the weight of that photograph. He saw it as leverage. I saw it as balance. He didn't know that the man in the photo had enemies far worse than me. He didn't know that this image, if mishandled, could reopen doors best left shut. He didn't know how many people had paid to forget. I had never shown the photo to Janine. She wouldn't understand. She believed in fairness, in rules, in truth. She thought the world worked like her HR manuals. She married Michael because he reminded her of her father. At least, the version of me she thought she knew. But I had lived too long in the margins of numbers to believe in clean lines. The photograph wasn't just paper. It was a symbol of power, of oversight, of forgotten debts. And now it was awake again. I didn't delete it from my phone. I didn't move it. I didn't rename it. I left it there. Let him wonder. Let him imagine. Let him lose sleep over the possibilities. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can give a man isn't proof. It's the suggestion that proof exists. It began with small things. A hesitation in the hallway. A pause before a question. A glance that lasted half a second too long. I started to feel it the morning after Michael returned my phone to the nightstand. Something in the house had shifted. Something subtle, but unmistakable. The way someone walks more quietly after breaking a glass. The way air tastes different after you've been watched. Michael's behavior didn't change drastically. He still left for work at 8:05 every morning. Still wore the same rotation of polo shirts and khakis. He still used that cheap, chemical-laced cologne that hovered in the stairwell long after he was gone. But the way he looked at me changed. Not openly. He wasn't stupid. But in the cracks. The quick glances when he thought I wasn't watching. The slight tension in his voice when I entered a room. Janine didn't notice. She never did. She had grown used to living beside tension. Most people do, if it doesn't shout. She kissed him on the cheek, packed the kids' lunches, and filled the dishwasher while humming half-forgotten tunes. Her world was made of patterns. Predictable, manageable, repeatable. She didn't question the silence between us. She was too busy trying to hold everything together with soft hands and good intentions. I didn't confront him. I had nothing to confront him with. Not yet. But the smell of suspicion, once it's in the air, never really goes away. It seeps into the cushions, into the food, into the way coffee tastes in the morning. That week, everything started to taste slightly off. My tea was too bitter. The eggs were too dry. Even the water from the tap had a metallic edge, like it had passed through something it shouldn't have. I spent more time in my room, but I wasn't hiding. I was watching, listening. A house tells you everything if you're quiet enough. I heard the way Michael's footsteps slowed outside my door. I noticed how Janine's phone rang more often, and how she started walking into the laundry room to answer it. I saw the way Michael started locking his car with the remote twice, like he didn't trust the first click. These weren't mistakes. These were habits formed out of fear. Fear of discovery. Fear of consequence. One afternoon, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water and found Michael standing by the fridge, staring at something on his phone. He didn't hear me at first. When he looked up, his face changed. Not with guilt, with calculation. He smiled, That small, tight-lipped smile men use when they want you to believe they know something you don't. He asked if I was feeling better. I told him I was. He said something about the weather. I nodded. We stood there for a moment, two men pretending they were not playing chess. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were cold. I remembered what it felt like to be in a deposition room years ago when the firm I worked for had to defend a subcontractor dispute. I wasn't involved, but I'd been called in to testify about a series of payment authorizations. The lawyers had been polite, but clinical. They dissected words, paused over phrases, looked for cracks. That same feeling settled in my chest again now, the careful dismantling of surface truth. Michael had seen something, but he hadn't understood it. That was my only advantage. He had the image, but not the story. And in a world like this, story is everything. A photograph without context is a ghost. It can haunt, but it cannot kill, unless someone gives it a name. That night, I left the bedroom door open an inch. Not wide, just enough. I wanted to see if he would return. He didn't, but I heard him pass by twice, once around midnight. Once at 3:17 a.m., I checked the clock both times. His footsteps paused each time near my door. I could almost hear the war in his head. Enter or retreat. He chose retreat, for now. The next morning, my phone had moved 1/4 of an inch. I measured it with my eyes, the way men who have lived alone for decades learn to measure the world. The indentation in the carpet, the way the charger cable curved differently. It was subtle, but it was real. Michael had returned, but this time I had changed the game. I had replaced the image, not deleted, not erased, just swapped. I had used an old photo editing app to replace the file with something harmless. A photo of my old fishing trip with 2 of my high school buddies, taken by a stranger on a pier in Michigan. The man beside me looked vaguely similar to the one in the original image, but the context was gone. The building was a dock. The papers were a tackle box. It was noise, nothing more. If Michael went back to search for the image, he would find it neutered, confusing, useless, and if he tried to confront me, he would have nothing. Only his memory, flawed and incomplete. I had turned the knife in his hand into rubber. That day, Janine mentioned something odd during lunch. She said Michael had asked her about my pension plan, whether it was still active, whether I had named a beneficiary. She thought he was being considerate, worried about my future. I nodded and said I was grateful for his concern, but in my head, I saw the full picture. Michael was planning something. He didn't just want to know. He wanted to possess, control, use. He saw me as a resource, a door to something larger than himself. And now that he had glimpsed the past, he thought he could walk through it without consequences. He had no idea how deep that past ran. I began going through my old boxes that night. Not the financial ones, the personal ones. Letters, notes, receipts, names written in the margins of forgotten invoices. I had kept more than I'd admitted, even to myself, not out of paranoia, but out of habit. Accountants don't throw away anything, especially not ghosts. I slept with the door locked that night, not out of fear, out of intention. Let him wonder what I knew. Let him dream about what I might say. Suspicion, I had learned, was not a weakness. It was a signal that truth was circling. The walls in that house were never thick, but there was a time I believed they held things. Warmth, privacy, trust. They weren't built for grandeur, just function. Drywall and insulation over 2x4s, painted in neutral colors, chosen to offend no one. But somewhere along the line, they stopped being walls and became screens. Porous, thin, transparent. The kind of walls that let everything through but held nothing back. It started to dawn on me one late Thursday morning when I was sitting in the living room, watching a squirrel gnaw at the wooden edge of the back deck. I had been alone in the room for an hour, or at least I thought I was alone. When I stood to get a glass of water, I saw the flicker of movement, a shadow at the top of the stairs, a shape that vanished the moment my feet hit the hardwood. I paused and listened. The house was silent, but the kind of silence that hums with surveillance. Michael claimed to be working from home more often, conference calls, digital transition projects. I never asked questions. He wanted me to. That was part of his method, offering just enough curiosity bait to lure you into asking so he could control the answer. But I had learned, over years of financial audits and unspoken office politics, that silence could be sharper than a question. People fill silence with the truth they fear most. He began to move differently through the house. I noticed how often he paused near the hallway outside my room, not just walking, but standing, as if listening, as if measuring something. Once I opened the door abruptly, and he jerked backward so quickly that he knocked a picture frame off the wall. He laughed, said he was checking the thermostat, but it wasn't cold. Then I saw the smart speaker in the kitchen had changed. It wasn't the one they had used before. This one had a new glowing ring around its base, the kind that pulses when it's waiting for a command or recording. I knew the model. I had seen the commercials. It could hear everything from across the room. They placed it next to the fruit bowl, where it could help with recipes. But no one cooked without their phone in hand anymore. I began to speak less. I made my movements slower, more deliberate. I left my bedroom window open, even on cold nights. Letting the real air in made the place feel human again. I stopped taking phone calls inside the house. I would step out onto the back porch, pretend to be checking the weather, and call the few people I still spoke to. Not that there were many, but the few I trusted deserved to hear my voice without interference. The children stopped visiting my room. I didn't blame them. Children sense things before adults do. They pick up on shifts in temperature, in tone, in the rhythm of footsteps. They may not have known what was happening, but they felt it. The house had changed. The air was charged. Every laugh came with a glance. Every touch came with a question. And in a house where nothing is private, even a whisper becomes a broadcast. One evening, I sat in the living room after everyone had gone to bed. The television was off. The only light came from the dim lamp beside the couch. I could hear the refrigerator hum in the kitchen, steady and mindless. But then I noticed something odd. The hallway light, which was usually off by 10, was on. I rose slowly and walked toward it. At the end of the hallway, by the office door, the glow of a computer monitor spilled out into the carpet. Michael was inside. He didn't see me. He was sitting at the desk, eyes fixed on the screen. I could see the back of his head, the way his neck tensed. His hand moved slowly over the mouse. The screen showed a series of folders. I recognized the file names. They were mine, backups from an old USB I thought I had erased. I had left that drive in a desk drawer years ago, forgotten under layers of old envelopes and tax documents. He must have found it. Or maybe he had always known it was there. I turned away without making a sound. I didn't need to see more. I had seen enough. The next morning, I searched the office while they were out. I didn't open drawers. I didn't touch the computer. I didn't leave a trace. But I stood there, silently, and I listened to the sound the house made around me. The creaks, the hums, the tiny clicking of the smart speaker recalibrating its microphone. And in that moment, it was clear to me. This house no longer belonged to people. It belonged to signals. Every room had eyes. Every hallway had ears. There were no longer boundaries, only overlapping zones of exposure. I wasn't living with a family anymore. I was living inside a system, one built not on love, but on control. Janine remained unaware, or maybe she chose to be. When I tried to bring up the speaker, she brushed it off. Said the kids liked to ask it for music. Said it helped with homework. Said it was just tech. But her smile was brittle, and her voice carried a rehearsed calm I had come to distrust. I began to test the walls. I would leave scraps of paper with nonsense sentences in plain view. Meet at 4. Package delivered early. Shred all receipts. I'd leave them in the laundry room, in the bathroom, under the seat cushion of the couch. And then I waited and watched. Some disappeared. Others reappeared in different rooms. One note, folded neatly, ended up in my sock drawer, a place I hadn't opened in 2 days. That's when I knew. Someone was inside my space when I wasn't there. The walls weren't just listening. They were moving, rearranging. I didn't panic. I had lived through worse. But I began to document everything. Not on the phone, not on the computer. By hand. In a small leather-bound ledger I had used in the 90s to record per diem rates and fuel expenses. Each entry was written in pencil. Each day had a title. Each title told a different version of the same truth. The house had no walls, and if I was going to survive it, I would need to build my own. Not with wood, not with drywall, but with something far harder to breach. Discretion, silence, and time. Time to prepare. Time to let them feel comfortable. Because people only make mistakes when they think they're safe. And Michael was beginning to look very, very safe. There was a weight to certain memories that never diminished, no matter how many years passed or how many other things tried to bury them. I felt that weight settle on me the moment I took the old binder from the back of the hallway closet. It was a cheap black thing, the kind given out at conferences, with a broken spine and creased corners. Janine once tried to throw it out during a spring cleaning. I told her it held some medical paperwork I might need. She didn't ask further. She trusted me. Inside that binder were documents from a time in my life I rarely let surface. Copies of contracts, project memos, handwritten notes from people who preferred not to type. Pages that carried the quiet fingerprints of power, the kind that didn't announce itself but could pull strings from a distance. Most of it was old, irrelevant now. But I wasn't looking for relevance. I was looking for threads, and I found them. Buried between 2 yellowing budget reports was a faded envelope. Inside it was a photo I hadn't seen in over 20 years, not the one Michael had found on my phone, a different one, less formal, less posed. I was seated at a folding table in a job site trailer, my tie loosened, sleeves rolled. Beside me, the same man from the other photograph, the man who had since become a state-level name, was laughing at something I had said. His face was relaxed, too relaxed for someone with that much to lose. On the table was a stack of papers, half-signed, and a bottle of bourbon someone had brought in celebration. The photo wasn't damning on its own, but it was real, and it reminded me that everything I had lived through still breathed somewhere. I wasn't imagining the stakes. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being cautious. After I returned the binder to its place, I sat by the window and watched the street. I had developed a habit of watching cars as they turned the corner, trying to guess who belonged in the neighborhood and who didn't. It wasn't about suspicion. It was about control. I had so little of it left in my body. Watching gave me something to hold. Later that evening, Michael came home later than usual. His car pulled in slowly, like he was buying time before stepping inside. He lingered in the driver's seat for a few minutes, illuminated by the faint blue glow of the dashboard. I could see his mouth moving, talking to someone, maybe on the phone, maybe rehearsing. When he finally came in, he walked straight to the kitchen. I remained in the recliner, pretending to nap. I heard the fridge open, then close. A cabinet creaked. He didn't speak, neither did I, but I watched his reflection in the darkened television screen. The way he moved, the angle of his shoulders. He was carrying something, and it wasn't groceries. That night, I placed the old photo inside a book on my nightstand, not for safekeeping, for proximity. I wanted it close. I wanted the weight of it near me as I fell asleep. It wasn't fear that kept me awake. It was something more restless. The feeling that I was being walked toward a cliff edge by someone who thought I wouldn't notice the drop. The next day, Janine mentioned Michael was considering a career change. Consulting, she said. Independent work. She seemed pleased, hopeful that it would give him more flexibility. But I heard the edge in her voice, the uncertainty. She didn't understand the sudden shift. Neither did I. But I had my suspicions. Consulting meant autonomy. Autonomy meant freedom. And freedom, in Michael's hands, meant danger. I took a walk around the block that afternoon. My cane dragged slightly behind me, the rubber tip worn thin from use. The sun was out, but the light was pale, and the wind moved like it had somewhere to be. As I passed each house, I watched the way curtains moved, the way porch lights flicked on automatically. The world had grown full of eyes, most of them digital, but some eyes were still human. A man on the corner nodded at me. I nodded back. We didn't speak. We never had. But he always noticed when I passed. That kind of noticing mattered. When I returned, I saw something new. Michael had installed a motion sensor in the hallway. He hadn't mentioned it. I hadn't heard anything about it. But there it was, mounted discreetly above the coat hooks, angled downward, the kind that logs movement, sends notifications. He would say it was for security, for the children, for peace of mind. But it faced my door. That evening, I turned the pages of my old notebook and found a line I had written in 1987 during a difficult project. Never underestimate the man who smiles during negotiations. He's already calculated your exit. I underlined it again, 36 years later. I spent most of that night awake, listening. I listened to the way Michael's chair creaked in the office upstairs, the way his footsteps moved back and forth like a pendulum. I listened for the silence that comes when someone is reading something they shouldn't, when the words on a screen or a page knock the wind out of them. I didn't hear it, but I felt it, like a ripple through the drywall. At 2:23 a.m., I rose from bed and walked to the kitchen. I didn't need water. I didn't need food. I needed to feel the floor under my feet, to remind myself that I still occupied space in this house, not just air. As I passed the hallway mirror, I caught my own reflection and stopped. I looked older than I remembered, more fragile. But there was something in my eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Focus. I stared at myself for a long moment, then turned away. As I moved toward my room, I felt something behind me. Not a sound, not a presence, just a certainty. I didn't turn around immediately. I took one more step, then another, and then I stopped. I looked over my shoulder. Michael stood at the top of the stairs, in the dark, watching. He didn't say a word. Neither did I. I turned back and entered my room, closing the door behind me with deliberate calm. I sat on the edge of the bed and let my pulse settle. The silence in the house was deafening, but beneath it, something had finally cracked. A man only watches that closely when he fears what he's missed. He had gone too far, or not far enough. Either way, he was afraid, and that gave me the advantage. Dinner had always been a formality in that house. It wasn't about food, or comfort, or family. It was routine. A clockwork performance in which each of us played the part expected of us. Janine served from the same ceramic bowls she'd picked out years ago at a discount store. The children recited school day fragments between mouthfuls. Michael, ever the tired provider, leaned back in his chair and let the others orbit him. I sat quietly, always at the far end of the table, where the light didn't reach fully and the conversation rarely landed. But that night, Something in the air was wrong. It wasn't the food. It wasn't the weather. It was something deeper, denser, a shift in the current beneath our feet. Janine had made meatloaf, her go-to dish when she wanted comfort, but didn't want to ask for it. The kind of dinner she could make with muscle memory, while her thoughts drifted. I watched her hands shake slightly as she scooped the mashed potatoes, not enough to spill, but enough to notice. Her eyes kept flicking toward Michael, then back to her plate. She didn't ask me how my day had been. She always asked, even if she never really listened. That night, she didn't. Michael, on the other hand, was too still. He didn't fidget with his phone. He didn't check his watch. He didn't lean forward to say something to the children. He sat back, his fork moving in a lazy rhythm, eating like a man playing for time. There was no background noise. The television was off. The kitchen speaker was unplugged. Even the dog next door, usually a constant in our evenings, was silent. I chewed my food slowly, watching the condensation form on the window beside me. It was early spring, but the night still carried the coldness of a season unwilling to leave. The children spoke about a school project involving models of the solar system. Their voices were light, unaware. But Janine wasn't listening. And Michael, he watched me. Not directly. He was too careful for that. But I could feel it. The way you can feel heat from an oven even before you open the door. He studied me through the clinks of silverware, through the pauses in conversation, measuring, calculating. I had spent most of the day reviewing documents I hadn't touched in decades, names I hadn't spoken out loud in over 20 years, events that had slipped behind the veil of irrelevant history in my mind, until now. I remembered things I thought I had forgotten, backroom deals, project adjustments, donations masked as consultant fees. I saw how much of it was still dangerous, not because it was illegal, but because it was unspoken, because it lived in the margins, where people like Michael now prowled. He took a sip of water, then set the glass down too softly. That's when I noticed it. His left hand had a tremor, barely there, but it hadn't been there before. I continued eating, slowly, methodically, and then he said my name. Raymond. It was casual, just a prompt, a signal that he wanted to speak, but not here, not now, just later. I nodded once and kept eating. I felt Janine look at me from across the table. Her eyes were tired, but there was something else, a flicker of concern, or perhaps recognition. She excused the children after dessert. They ran off upstairs, the thunder of small feet on carpet echoing up through the bones of the house. Michael poured himself a second glass of wine. He didn't usually drink during the week. He offered the bottle to me. I declined with a small shake of the head. Then he began to talk. It wasn't a conversation. It was a performance. He told a story about a man he used to work with, a client who had a lot of baggage, who held on to old records, and who eventually slipped up. He smiled as he said it, as if he were sharing a harmless anecdote. But I heard the barbs between the words, the warning dressed as a fable. I listened. I kept my face still. He continued. Another story, this one about opportunity and timing. He said the word legacy 3 times, said trust twice, never said threat, but I heard it loud and clear. Janine cleared the table in silence. Her movements were fast, nervous. She didn't meet my eyes. The sound of dishes clinking into the sink felt sharper than usual, like glass against bone. When Michael finally stood to leave the room, he placed his hand on my shoulder. A simple gesture, but there was pressure behind it. Not enough to hurt, just enough to assert. I didn't move. I let it sit there a moment, then slowly turned my head and looked at him. I didn't speak, neither did he, but the silence between us stretched and tightened like a rope, and then he walked away. Janine sat back down across from me. She looked older than I remembered. Her eyes were rimmed with worry, and her lips trembled slightly. She opened her mouth to say something, but then thought better of it. She stood up again and followed her husband upstairs. I remained at the table. The light from the chandelier buzzed faintly. A bulb had started to flicker. I reached for the wine glass he'd left behind. I turned it slightly. On the base was a smear of something. Grease or ink, I couldn't tell. I wiped it away with the sleeve of my shirt. I sat there long after the house went quiet. I thought about the photograph again, about how many years had passed since it was taken, about how much power was still buried in the expression on that man's face, frozen in time. And I thought about Michael, how desperate he must be to possess something he didn't understand. He was playing a game that had been over before he was born, but he didn't know that. He believed he was in control, and belief in the wrong hands was more dangerous than proof. I rose from the table and turned off the light. The room fell into darkness, but the shadow he'd left behind remained. The wind that came through the screen window that morning wasn't like the others. It didn't carry the usual smells of mulch and car exhaust, or the distant thrum of school buses rumbling down the neighborhood lanes. It was sharper, more deliberate. It smelled of something I couldn't name, like a shift in weather, but not just in the air. It stirred something in me. Not fear, not dread. Something older, something like readiness. I rose earlier than usual. The house was still quiet, the children not yet rustling in their sheets, Janine still asleep, and Michael likely already awake, pretending to read emails in his home office with a mug of coffee he didn't even sip. I moved slowly, not because of pain, though that was always there in the joints and in the ribs, but because I needed to be deliberate. The silence of the house had become my partner, and I didn't like to break it without reason. At the bottom of the hall closet was a box labeled Taxes 2004. No one had touched it in years. It was the kind of box that looked like trash to anyone else, brittle, yellowing, the corners stained with time. But I had hidden something under those irrelevant forms, something that wasn't for the IRS. I pulled the box out and brought it to my room. My hands trembled, not from nerves, but from age. I hated that about getting old. The hands still remembered precision, but the body betrayed the memory. Inside the box, beneath layers of paper I had stacked with purpose, was a manila envelope. I hadn't opened it in over a decade. There were documents in there, originals, the kind of papers that never go through email, signatures, stamps, agreements, and 2 photos, not just the one Michael had seen. One showed me at a different site, a hospital project, smaller than the housing development but tied to the same group. I stood between 2 men, one a contractor who later fled the country, the other a state inspector who had, for a few years, gained quite a bit of weight before abruptly resigning and disappearing from the public eye. I hadn't thought of either of them in years. I didn't even remember why I kept the photo, but now it all came flooding back. The other photograph was smaller, just a corner shot, taken through a window. It showed a hand exchanging an envelope. I was not in this one, but I had taken it. From the inside of a trailer, through the dusty glass. I had meant to destroy it, but I hadn't. Something in me, even back then, wanted to keep proof, not to hurt anyone, but to keep truth anchored to something physical. Michael didn't know these existed. He only knew what he had seen on my phone, and he thought that was all there was. I pulled a clean envelope from my drawer and slipped the 2 photographs inside, along with a single sheet of paper I'd written long ago. A summary. No accusations, no threats, just facts. I sealed it and addressed it to a name I hadn't spoken aloud in decades, a man who owed me a favor, or feared what I knew. Either way, I trusted he would understand what receiving the envelope meant. After breakfast, when Michael went upstairs to make his calls, and Janine took the children to a birthday party, I walked to the end of the block and dropped the envelope in the blue USPS collection box. The sound it made when it landed was softer than I expected, but it echoed inside me like a bell. When I returned, Michael was in the kitchen. He looked up, surprised, asked where I'd gone. I told him I went for a walk. Nothing more. He smiled, tight, artificial. He was trying to read me, and I let him. That day, I began moving things. Not furniture, not boxes, my digital trail. I started by erasing the browser history on my phone. Then I deleted every photo, every screenshot, every accidental capture, every fragment of anything that didn't belong. I backed up what I needed onto a USB, encrypted it, and placed it inside a hollowed-out dictionary on my bookshelf. I made sure the dust pattern on the top stayed untouched. I changed the lock screen on my phone to a quote that only one other person would recognize. A quote from a letter my late wife had written me once when I was away on a work trip. "Some winds don't break trees, they teach them how to lean." I wasn't breaking. I was learning to lean. That afternoon, Michael's tone shifted. He became more generous. He offered to drive me to the bank, asked if I needed anything from the pharmacy, brought me a new blanket for the recliner. I thanked him. I smiled. I let him believe it was working. He had tasted what he thought was control, and he was adjusting his grip. But he didn't realize what control actually felt like. He thought it was dominance, pressure, access. But real control doesn't announce itself. It waits, it watches, and it moves only when the timing is no longer guesswork. It's instinct. By evening, a storm had rolled in. The sky turned that particular shade of yellow-gray that always made me uneasy, like the color of old bruises. The wind picked up. Branches knocked against the windows. The power flickered once, then steadied. Michael poured himself a drink. A scotch. Neat. He asked if I wanted one. I said no. We sat in the living room, neither of us speaking. The wind outside grew louder. It wasn't a dangerous storm, but it was enough to make the house creak. I wondered if the walls remembered the secrets they held, the conversations whispered in kitchens, the quiet violence of power misunderstood. Michael looked at me then, really looked, as if trying to decide whether I was still the old man in the back room or something else entirely. I didn't blink. I didn't break eye contact. I let the moment stretch until he turned away. Later that night, I lay in bed and listened to the wind move through the vents. It had a rhythm to it, like breathing, like a warning, or maybe a promise. I knew the envelope would reach its destination in 2 days, and by then, nothing in this house would feel the same again. The wind wasn't just outside anymore. It was moving through everything. It was a Tuesday when I noticed the first real crack. Not a loud one, not the kind that split walls or broke voices, but a hairline fracture, so thin and so precise that it would have gone unnoticed by anyone who hadn't been studying the surface as long as I had. The kind of crack that doesn't come from impact, but from pressure, silent, sustained, and ignored. The morning began with the ordinary noises, the soft slam of cabinet doors, the rush of water through the upstairs pipes, the faint beeping of the microwave. The children were already at school. Janine had gone to the grocery store. Michael was working from home again, which now seemed to mean pacing from one room to another, with a phone permanently glued to his ear, murmuring half-sentences and empty buzzwords. I was in the living room, pretending to read the paper. The news had long ceased to interest me. It was the same cycle in different clothes: outrage, distraction, silence. What I was really doing was watching. The reflection in the glass of the fireplace told me everything I needed. I saw Michael pause in the hallway, turn his head toward the office, then double back. He moved like a man looking for something, but trying to seem like he wasn't. He was searching. I didn't know what exactly. A file. A drive. A clue. Whatever he thought I had hidden, he hadn't found it. Yet. Around noon, Janine came home. I heard her drop her keys on the counter, the grocery bags rustling. I rose to help her, even though I didn't need to. I wanted to be in the kitchen when they spoke. I wanted to listen. She thanked me quietly and began unpacking. Michael entered a moment later, phone still in hand, but he paused when he saw me. His expression flickered for half a second. Annoyance, maybe, or disappointment. He wanted me gone. I knew that much, but I was beginning to suspect he wanted more than my absence. He wanted my silence, and not just in the literal sense. Janine pulled a receipt from one of the bags, frowned, then glanced at Michael. She asked him why a charge had appeared on their joint card from an office supply store she didn't recognize. He brushed it off, said it was for work. Something about client materials. But I saw her expression shift, just slightly. Her eyebrows didn't raise. They drew in. Not curiosity, not suspicion. Something deeper. Recognition. He continued talking, too much and too fast. She let him finish, nodded, and went back to unloading groceries. She didn't say another word, but her hands moved faster, tighter. The oranges hit the counter a little too hard. That was it. That was the moment. The crack. She didn't trust him completely. Not anymore. I stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed to, wiping the already clean table, rearranging the placemats, pouring myself another glass of water. Neither of them asked me to leave, but I knew I was being watched. Later that afternoon, Janine came into my room. She hadn't done that in weeks. She knocked first, softly, then peeked her head in and asked if I wanted her to do the laundry. I thanked her, said I'd already done it, which was a lie. She lingered. Her eyes moved across the room, pausing briefly on the bookshelf where I had returned the hollowed-out dictionary. She didn't ask anything, but her eyes stayed too long. When she left, I sat down and stared at the floor. I wondered how much she had noticed, whether she had seen Michael checking my room, whether she had followed him once, whether she had read something she wasn't meant to read. She wasn't the kind of woman to confront someone outright. She absorbed things, filed them away, let them form patterns. She was her father's daughter. That evening, dinner was even quieter than usual. The children seemed oblivious, chattering about something they had learned in science class. Michael didn't engage. Janine barely touched her food. I chewed slowly, watching both of them from beneath lowered lids. Then Michael spoke. He said something about getting things in order, about how he and Janine had been discussing downsizing. He looked at me when he said it, though his words were directed at the whole table. I understood immediately. It was a signal, a test. He wanted to see how much I would resist, how much I had guessed. Janine said nothing, not even a nod. I put down my fork, wiped my mouth with the cloth napkin, and said that the house belonged to them, and I would follow whatever plan they chose. My tone was even, my expression unreadable. But my words weren't what mattered. What mattered was the silence that followed. Michael smiled, a thin, victorious line. But Janine didn't. Her fingers twitched beside her glass. She didn't reach for it. That night I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside tapping against the window pane. My hands rested on my chest, one atop the other. I breathed slowly, steadily, counting each exhale. Sometime around midnight I heard footsteps. Not children, not Janine. Michael. He walked past my door, paused, then moved on. I waited. 15 minutes later, I heard Janine's voice, low, urgent, not angry, but firm. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I heard the tone. She was asking questions now. He was lying. And she knew. The fracture had begun. Not a break. Not yet. But the first hairline crack had split the surface, and nothing spreads faster than doubt. I had spent much of my life watching other men hold power. Real power. Not the loud kind that politicians swing like hammers, or the soft kind whispered behind closed doors, but the kind that fits perfectly in one hand. Neither heavy nor light, but solid, known, and utterly unshakable. The kind of power that comes not from having something, but from knowing exactly when to reveal that you do. That morning, I decided it was time to let Michael see his reflection. I began the day the way I always did, quietly. I sat by the window and listened to the neighborhood wake up, the delivery truck coughing as it backed into the cul-de-sac, the distant buzz of lawnmowers, the birds announcing nothing in particular. It was a rhythm I had come to rely on. While the world moved in loops, I moved in lines. At 7:32 a.m., I slipped the envelope beneath his office door. There was no note, just the photograph, the real one, and a copy of the letter I had written years ago. Not a threat, not an accusation, just a memory in ink, signed and dated in careful penmanship, with names that still meant something. I wanted to see what he would do with it, whether he would burn it, deny it, or try to use it. I didn't care which. What mattered was what it would show him. Not about me, about himself. An hour passed before I heard the creak of the door opening. I remained in my chair. I didn't look. I didn't need to. The sound of paper sliding from the floor. The silence that followed. A man learning he is not the only one with eyes. A man realizing he is no longer the one holding the curtain. Michael didn't come down for breakfast. Janine noticed. She asked if I had seen him. I said no. She said he'd locked the door behind him and hadn't answered when she knocked. The children were at school. The house was still. The air held that particular pressure, like the heaviness before a thunderstorm, not in clouds, but in the spaces between words. I sat at the dining table and waited. At noon, he appeared. His face was calm, but the wrong kind of calm. The kind a man wears when he's trying to remember how to be human. He walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge without saying anything. The door stayed open longer than it needed to. He pulled out a bottle of water, closed the door, and turned to face me. His hands trembled. Just slightly. Enough to betray him. He asked if I'd gone through his desk. I told him I hadn't. He didn't push. He just nodded once and took a long sip from the bottle. Then he walked back upstairs. That was when I knew. He didn't understand what I had given him. He thought the photograph was a threat, a warning, a line in the sand. But it wasn't. It was a mirror, and he couldn't look into it without seeing something he didn't like. That evening, Janine asked me to help her fold the laundry. I sat beside her on the couch, folding towels with fingers that still remembered structure. She was quiet, focused, but I could tell her thoughts were elsewhere. I asked if everything was all right. She hesitated, then said Michael had been distant, distracted. She didn't know why. I wanted to tell her. I wanted to reach across the fragile boundary between us and offer her the whole story, unvarnished and ugly. But I didn't. Because she still loved him. And sometimes you have to let people come to the truth on their own. Later, after she went to bed, I walked through the house. Slowly, methodically. I stood in each room and took inventory, not of objects, of stories. The place was full of them. The faint scratches on the banister where the kids had dragged toys, the spot on the living room wall where the paint didn't match, the dent in the hallway from a dropped suitcase, a house layered in the sediment of memory. But something had shifted. There was a new silence now, a listening silence, the kind that comes after something breaks, not loudly, but deeply. In Michael's office, the envelope was no longer on the desk. The trash was empty. The drawer beside the keyboard was locked. He had reacted. He had acted. And now he was thinking. That was good, because thought leads to doubt, and doubt opens cracks. I went back to my room and sat at the edge of the bed. I opened the drawer and removed the second envelope. Identical. Inside, another copy of the photo. Another letter, addressed to someone else. I placed it on the desk. Tomorrow, I would walk it to the post office. The storm hadn't come yet, but the pressure had changed. And in the mirror he now carried, Michael would see something no man wants to face. His reflection not as he believed he was, but as he had become. And once you've seen that version of yourself, you don't sleep quite the same again. Certainty is a kind of armor. It's what men like Michael wear every day, tailored, pressed, and invisible to the naked eye. It fits under their smiles and behind their words. It allows them to believe they're untouchable, unshakable, always 2 steps ahead. But like all armor, certainty has a weakness, not from the outside, from within. It corrodes slowly, quietly. It begins as a whisper, not a scream. And that morning, I could hear the metal starting to buckle. I woke up early, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I didn't want to. I didn't want to miss it. I had felt the tension rising in the house like the slow tightening of a rope, the kind that looks decorative at first, then begins to pull. Every sound had started to feel louder, every movement more weighted. I dressed carefully, pulling on an old cardigan with frayed sleeves and smoothing the collar until it sat right. I looked at myself in the mirror, not to adjust my appearance, but to steady my expression. I needed to be neutral, calm, as though the day ahead was no different from any other. At breakfast, Michael didn't come down. Janine sat at the table staring into her coffee. The children were already gone, dropped off early for a school field trip. The silence in the kitchen was deep. She didn't ask where he was. I didn't either. I waited until she left for errands, some vague excuse about needing printer paper and dish soap, and then I made my way upstairs. His office door was ajar. He never left it open. I stood there for a moment, listening. I could hear his breathing, shallow, uneven. Then the creak of the floor as he shifted in his chair. I pushed the door gently, enough to see inside. He sat at his desk, shoulders hunched, staring at the photograph. Not the original. A copy, crumpled at the edges. He had printed it, enlarged it. The grain was visible now, the pixels like tiny fissures. He had circled something in red ink. I couldn't see what from the doorway, but I knew. His eyes didn't move when I stepped in. He didn't acknowledge me. He just sat there, staring. I said nothing. I simply walked to the small bookshelf across the room and adjusted one of the volumes that had been nudged out of place. A meaningless act, but it gave me a reason to stand there without speaking. When I turned to leave, he finally looked at me. His eyes were different, not angry, not defiant, fractured. The confidence he wore like cologne had evaporated. What remained was the pale sheen of realization. He had thought the photo was a threat, a move in a game he believed he understood. But now he knew it was more than that. It was history. It was weight, and it was something he couldn't explain away or bury. I left the room without a word. Later I watched from the front window as he paced in the backyard, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. He spoke with sharp, animated gestures, the kind men make when they're trying to convince someone, or themselves, that they're still in control. He turned in circles, stopped, started again. Once he threw his free hand into the air as if swatting away a fly, or a truth. I didn't need to know who he was calling. I had already mailed the second envelope. By lunchtime, he had come back inside. He didn't speak to me. He didn't even look. He walked straight into the garage and stood there for almost an hour, pretending to rearrange tools, opening and closing drawers that held nothing but rusted nails and tangled cords. Janine came home to find him sitting at the kitchen table. She asked if he was okay. He said yes, but the lie landed like a stone in a pond, ripples expanding in every direction. She looked at me, and I knew she saw it too. The shift, the sag in his shoulders, the hollow in his voice. That night I heard them argue. They kept their voices low, but the house has a way of amplifying what it wants you to hear. I caught fragments, words like trust and why and what were you thinking. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was clear. His replies were clipped, defensive, and then silence. The kind of silence that follows damage, the kind you can't patch over with flowers or apologies. I sat in the dark of my room and waited. Eventually, I heard the soft knock. Janine. She stood in the doorway, arms folded tightly across her chest, not to protect herself, but to keep herself from shaking. She asked if she could sit. I nodded. She didn't ask me directly. She didn't need to. She spoke in quiet generalities, about confusion, about secrets, about the feeling that something had been going on for longer than she realized. I listened. I let her speak. When she finished, I opened the drawer beside me and handed her a different envelope. Not the photo, not the documents, just a letter. A plain letter I had written years ago. A personal account. My truth. Not meant for courtrooms or headlines. Meant for her, in case the day ever came when she needed it. She held it in her lap like it was heavier than paper. She didn't open it then. She just sat there for a moment, then rose and left the room. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of certainty breaking. Not mine. His. The photograph was never meant to survive this long. Not physically, and certainly not in meaning. It had been taken on a whim, captured in a moment neither planned nor significant at the time. But moments have a strange way of fermenting in silence. They gather weight with age, like stones left in water. Eventually, they sink to the bottom of everything, waiting for the current to disturb them. I spent that morning seated at the far end of the dining room table, alone. A cup of coffee, barely warm, sat in front of me. I didn't drink it. I rarely finished my coffee anymore. It was more ritual than necessity, a signal to the house that I was still here. I stared out the window, watching a squirrel bury something in the garden bed. I envied its simplicity. Dig, hide, forget. Across the room, Michael moved like a man under observation. He didn't need to. He knew the photograph was out of his control now. That night, Janine cooked a meal she hadn't made in years. Chicken parmesan, from an old family recipe that her mother used to make on special occasions. It was her way of trying to anchor the evening. I could see the effort in her movements, the precise way she arranged the silverware, the fresh napkins folded at each place setting. But effort doesn't erase tension. It only decorates it. Michael sat stiffly at the table, eating slowly. He chewed longer than necessary, as though each bite might buy him time. Janine spoke to the children, asked about their day, smiled too brightly. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. After dinner, she asked Michael to help her clean up. He hesitated for a moment too long, then rose and followed her into the kitchen. I remained seated, listening to the clatter of plates and the hum of the dishwasher being loaded. Their conversation was low, punctuated by long silences. Later that night, I found Michael in the office. He sat in the dark, only the light of the computer screen illuminating his face. The photograph was open again. He had scanned it, zoomed in, examined it from every angle. I stepped into the doorway, my shadow stretching across the floor. He turned his head slightly, enough to know I was there. I asked if he was finished with it. He didn't answer, just turned back to the screen. I waited a moment, then stepped forward and reached for the keyboard. He didn't stop me. I deleted the file, emptied the recycle bin, closed the program. The image vanished, but we both knew that deletion was meaningless. The photograph was no longer a file. It was a fact. I told him the original no longer existed. That was also a lie. I had mailed it elsewhere, to someone who understood what to do with it should something happen to me. A final safeguard. I didn't enjoy deception, but I had learned its necessity. Truth only matters when people fear it might escape. Michael stood up and left the room without speaking. I remained behind, staring at the blank screen, listening to the hard drive whir and spin down. It reminded me of a sound I used to hear in the back of construction trailers, the generator powering down after a long day. It always left behind a kind of silence that didn't feel restful. It felt like a warning that the work wasn't finished. The next morning, he was gone. He left a note for Janine, something vague and noble sounding. Needing time, figuring things out, doing what's best. I didn't read the whole thing. I saw it on the kitchen counter, folded once and left beneath the ceramic spoon rest. The words meant nothing, but the absence, they spoke volumes. Janine didn't cry. She didn't ask me if I knew anything. She just sat down at the table and stared out the window. We sat like that for a long time. Two people who had both chosen silence and who now shared the consequence of it. Later that week, a letter arrived for me. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence written in sharp black ink. We've received the material. It won't be forgotten. No name, no signature, no threat, just a sentence. I burned the letter that night, watched the flame take the paper slowly, curling it in waves, blackening the edges until it was gone. The fire didn't crackle. It hissed, soft, controlled. I stood there until the last ember died. The photograph had found its place, not in a drawer, not in a folder, in motion. And once truth starts moving, there's no telling where it will settle. There was no announcement, no final confrontation, no shouting match in the hallway or tearful apology at the kitchen table. When the reckoning came, it came without sound. It slipped through the rooms like smoke and settled over the house until the air was heavy with what had already happened. It did not roar. It did not shake the walls. It simply arrived. In the days after Michael left, the house changed. Not visibly, nothing dramatic or outward, but in tone. The tension that had once lived in the corners and behind closed doors dissolved. Even the floors creaked differently. The smart speaker in the kitchen remained unplugged. The office stayed closed. Janine walked slower, not from defeat, from relief. Her shoulders no longer curled inward. She made breakfast again. Real breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee that didn't taste like it had been rushed. The children asked about him at first, carefully, testing the waters with half-formed questions. Janine answered gently, but briefly. Enough to satisfy them for now. But they were smart, smarter than adults gave them credit for. They knew something had shifted. They just didn't know what to call it. I spent more time in the garden. The back patio, once a place I'd only passed through, became my new resting spot. I watched the wind move through the trees. I listened to the birds pick at the feeders. The sun came earlier now. Spring was moving in with purpose, and the cold that had lingered in the soil was finally loosening its grip. The envelope I had sent, my final safeguard, had done its work. I never heard from the man who received it. I never expected to. That kind of silence was its own language, the kind shared by men who had once lived under ceilings held up by secrets. He knew what it meant to receive a ghost in the mail. He understood that some messages were not requests. They were reminders. I never planned to use the photograph to destroy anyone. Not really. I didn't need destruction. I needed distance. I needed space from the man who tried to dismantle my presence while smiling at my daughter across the table. and I needed her to see him clearly, not through anger or betrayal, but through understanding, through time. Janine never asked what I had done. Maybe she knew. Maybe she didn't want to know. Maybe the quiet that followed his absence was answer enough. One night she brought me a blanket while I sat outside and placed it over my legs without a word. She rested her hand on my shoulder for a moment, then walked back inside. That touch, brief and hesitant, said more than any conversation we could have had. The silence in the house was no longer suspicious. It was restorative. I moved through it without caution. No more glancing over my shoulder. No more checking my doorframe for shadow or movement. I no longer woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps that didn't belong. And yet, the silence was not empty. It was full of memory. I thought often about the life I had led, the work, the compromises, the choices I had made in quiet rooms, the faces I remembered only in pieces, half smiles across a desk, ink-stained hands gripping contracts, nods exchanged in parking lots. I had never been a man of drama, but I had been a man of consequences, and now I was watching those consequences echo gently through the lives around me. I watched Janine begin to breathe again. I watched the children laugh without looking for permission. I watched the way the rooms started to reclaim their meaning. One afternoon, I found Michael's note still on the kitchen counter. It had been buried beneath a stack of unopened mail. I unfolded it, read it again. It said everything and nothing. He had written that he was sorry, though not for what. That he had made mistakes, though not which. That he hoped in time things would make sense. I folded the paper in half, then in half again. I placed it in the trash. He had already been erased by the silence. That night, I sat outside longer than usual. The air had cooled, and the wind was moving low and slow across the yard. The stars were out. Not many, but enough. I thought about the photograph again, about how it had changed everything by doing nothing. It had simply been seen, and sometimes that's all it takes. Not confrontation, not violence, just truth, allowed to stand in the open long enough to be noticed. I closed my eyes and listened. The refrigerator hummed inside. A dog barked somewhere down the block. The branches overhead swayed softly, creaking like old wood leaning into rest. And I knew, with the deep stillness that comes only at the end of a long road, that this was what justice looked like for men like me. Not courtrooms, not revenge, not headlines, just the slow, deliberate departure of those who thought you were already gone, and the quiet that follows. That was my silence, and it was enough.